And you can proceed, Mr. Chairman.
I'm calling to order this meeting of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chairman of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Today is Thursday, July 1st, 2021. The time is 4:08 in the afternoon. And we are conducting this meeting virtually. That is live via the Zoom video conference broadcast platform, live via Council Channel 13 cable television, and I believe live or streaming on the council website. The purpose of this meeting today is consideration of a report and recommendations of the Committee of the Whole on the fiscal year 2022 budget and corresponding Budget Support Act subtitles. Before we go any further, I'm going to ask Mr. Cash if you would call the roll to determine whether we have a quorum. Mr. Cash. Mr. Cash.
Can we say you're on mute, Mr. Cash?
Sorry about that, Mr. Chairman.
You're calling the roll. We're waiting for you to call the roll.
Chairman Mendelson.
Present.
Councilmember Allen.
Here.
Councilmember Bonds.
Here.
Councilmember Che.
Here.
Councilmember Gray. Councilmember Gray. Councilmember Henderson.
Here.
Councilmember Lewis George. Councilmember Lewis George. Councilmember McDuffie.
Here.
Councilmember Nadeau. Councilmember Nadeau. Councilmember Pinto. Councilmember Pinto. Councilmember Silverman.
Present.
Councilmember Robert White.
Present.
Councilmember Trayon White.
Present.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Thank you. I do see that a couple of the members who didn't respond are logged in, but they didn't respond. As I said, we have one item of business, and that is consideration of the report and recommendations of the Committee of the Whole on the fiscal year 2022 budget and corresponding Budget Support Act subtitles. I am not going to go through each chapter or each agency. I'm just going to highlight some of the changes that are being proposed in the in this report. We are accepting from the Committee on Transportation and the Environment of $16,800 for the UDC Master Gardener expansion for Ward 7 and 8 students. The $40,000 for the Food and Agricultural Regional Membership at the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. $200,000 for the council, that is us, the Council of the District of Columbia, to study a DC water lead service line replacement plan. I think that's so that we get our own independent assessment of what the cost is. $100,000 recurring for OSSI for the Zero Waste Grant Program, and $116,000 recurring to DCRA for funding DC Laws 23-194. This does say DC Law 23-194 EV Readiness Act. That's for electric vehicles. The report also transfers out funds to the Committee on Health to implement the Maternal Health Resources and Access Act of 2021. The committee report realigns the budget for the Commission on Arts and Humanities to adopt the Equity in Arts subtitle, which eliminates the National Capital Arts cohort and provides substantial funding for additional general operating grants. With regard to the Office of Planning, the report funds the PDR That's fancy language for industrial land use study, which was called for in the comprehensive plan. That's $250,000. And also identifies $250,000 within the Office of Planning to fund an Ivy City small area plan separate from the New York Avenue plan. The committee report with regard to the DC Charter School Board recognizes $5.4 million in savings to the revised FIS for the lead testing and removal. This aren't in my notes, but I believe that we are taking that money and putting it aside for stabilization with regard to enrollment. With regard to the Deputy Mayor for Education, eliminates Family Coaches Program and redirects some of the funds to out-of-school time grants. Decreases the MPD de-escalation training budget by $1.5 million. I want to note, even though I just said decrease MPD de-escalation training budget, this is money that's in the Deputy Mayor for Education. Redirects most of that money to the Committee on Health for Maternal Health Resources legislation. And with regard to the Deputy Mayor for Education, moves Career Coaches Program to the Workforce Investment Council. The committee report also moves DC Futures Tuition Assistance Program from OSSI to UDC. With regard to the State Board of Education, funds 2 new FTEs, one in the Ombudsman Office and the other in the Student Advocate Office, to focus on anticipated increases in casework post-pandemic. So those 2 offices over at the State Board have identified a need for additional FTEs. That's for the Ombudsman and the Student Advocate. But we think that that's especially critical right now because with the reopening of schools in the fall, that we anticipate increases in casework. The committee report also transfers some of the remaining above savings to a non-departmental account for charter enrollment stabilization funding. I mentioned that already. And increases OPEB administrative costs. I know everyone's on top of OPEB. That's the other employment, post-employment benefits program, and increases administrative costs for that, which are paid out of the OPEB fund for investment management. That's the report in highlight version. I'm happy to take questions. I do want to note for members who haven't figured this out that this is what we call the little committee of the whole. The big committee of the whole will be on the 20th, and that's where there'll be much more work being done. So, for example, I expect that over the next several weeks, I'll be working with members as well as my staff on some other shifts with regard to out-of-school time and childcare, and even funding shifts with regard to public education, both DCPS and charter schools, to enhance some of the programs that we think will help with recovering from learning loss. So you don't see that today, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to be working with you to develop that for the July 20th committee of the whole meeting. With that, I move the report with leave for staff to make technical, conforming, and editorial changes. Discussion, I see Councilmember Robert White.
Thank you, Chairman Mendelson. I do have one question and concern, and this is with respect to a portion, page 157 of the committee report that would give the commission, the Arts Commission, independent procurement authority. I have a general concern about this, but also a couple specific concerns. One, that the language is a little unclear to me. It says that the Commission plans to develop an MOU with the Office of Contracting and Procurement to continue many of the larger procurements, but I don't know what many here means, or if there's a specific category. And it also notes the effort to give more flexible procurement for smaller ticket items, but all agencies have flexibility with smaller ticket items. So there's a good bit of ambiguity here for me that I hope we can work through before we vote on the budget.
Absolutely, Council Member. You have oversight over procurement. And so I don't want to get crossways with you on this. And the commission is independent per the council's action several years ago. So the thinking was to give them more flexibility with regard to procurement. They still would have to comply with the Procurement Practices Reform Act. So they don't have flexibility in that regard. They'd have to follow the law. But if we've got it wrong or we need to refine that further, I absolutely want to work with you on that.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for bringing that up. Is there any other discussion on the report? Councilmember Allen.
I know I put my hand up. I think I saw Councilmember Silverman and Shea both had their virtual hands up before I raised my actual hand up. So,
Well, as I've tried to indicate before,
all right,
I
all
will
right,
call
I'll go.
folks.
I got it.
But I do see those hands, and in fact,
All
since I
right.
said that, now there are 3 hands up.
There's gonna be a lot of hands, a lot of hands. All right, then I'll just go fast. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks to your staff for the work. I know even whether we agree on every element or not, I know how hard all the staff works on this, so just grateful for that. A couple of quick items. I did want to appreciate the funding you just talked about earlier about the 1.5 million that ended up being redundant funding on the de-escalation training. So I appreciate that. And as you noted, that was a DME expenditure, not an NPD expenditure, but appreciate that. I also want to say thank you for supporting our school librarians. I still think we should make them a required full-time position. I think every school needs to have a librarian, end of sentence. I talked about this a lot in the spring and my concerns about the way in which DCPS handled this. I talked about the destabilizing effect of making it optional and then having these positions up on the chopping block. And isn't that going to make librarians or any other staff member like this see their position not being there next year and start to search for their jobs? And in a cruel twist of irony, my own children have lost their librarian for that exact reason, is that it became optional. And she had to look for a job to make sure she had one, even though positions got restored at the end of the day. The amount of destabilization that created meant that the librarian that had built years of a relationship with students is gone and now has to be completely replaced. So we need to create the predictability, the certainty that there is a librarian in every school, end of sentence, and that's it. And it doesn't become this game every year because it really hurts the librarians. And at the end of the day, it really hurts our kids. I want to thank you as well for your work on the vacant and blighted properties. More broadly, the problems with classifications for building for tax purposes. I know you and I've talked about this around some of the properties we've seen in Ward 6, but I know this is in other wards as well. It's a constant issue for properties classified as residential for property tax purposes, despite being obviously and publicly commercial properties, to residential properties that have been vacant for, in some cases, decades, while still being taxed at a lower rate. The point of a different tax rates for taxation is to incentivize properties being used as residences, which is especially important when we have such a crisis of affordable housing. I also want to thank you for putting some additional transparency requirements on the high dosage tutoring grant program. I agree with so many voices that we've heard who said this is a key program in addressing learning loss, but I also couldn't agree more with the sentiments that high dosage tutoring needs to be supplemental to core classes. I also want to thank you for the new position, FTE position at the State Board of Education. I know that's something that they've advocated for and I think will be important. Also our out of school time grants. I know we still need to do more, but really appreciate you've identified $2 million in that realm. Critically important. It's still not going to meet all the need, but is critically important. The last thing I just want to say is I am concerned about the language that I'm reading, that we shouldn't be acting boldly on birth to 3 this year. I don't think the language that I read in the report is consistent with the voices I heard advocating in support for birth to 3. I don't think it's consistent with the majority of this body who supports our birth to 3 effort. So I just wanted to flag that for you, and there may be some action on this later, but I'm concerned about the ways in which it's being portrayed, the ways in which, because the Committee of the Whole report speaks for all of us, and so I just want to flag that as a concern about the language about that effort. But otherwise, really want to appreciate all the hard work that's gone into this and the investments that are being made. So I appreciate Mr. Chairman, and I don't have any time left, so thank you.
Thank you. And I wasn't paying attention to the clock and I shouldn't admit that. Councilmember Che?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be supporting this budget recommendation today. There are a few recommendations, though, that I want to mention. especially because I'm proud of the work our two committees have been able to do jointly in the budget, including this $45,000 to fund this traffic analysis in the area around Hardy Park and MacArthur Boulevard, because it's the site of two new schools, proposed new schools. And the $40,000 to support making the FARM ad hoc committee a permanent committee of Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, COG, and the $200,000 to have this comprehensive assessment of DC Water's lead service line replacement plan, as you mentioned, $377,000 across the financial plan to implement the Electric Vehicle Readiness Amendment Act, you also mentioned, and the $16,800 for UDC's Master Gardener Program for 24 additional students from Wards 7 and 8, and $100,000 to support a grant for reducing food waste at schools. I do want to mention a couple of items, though, one of which Councilmember Allen has already brought up. I, too, was disappointed that the committee didn't identify funding to ensure that every DCPS school has a full-time librarian. Many, many studies have shown the tremendous impact a librarian can have on student learning and academic outcomes. And as we know, it's all the more important now, given coming out of the pandemic and learning loss. The cost for a full-time librarian is $112,600. And to gross up a library tech to a librarian would be $59,638. If we gave a new librarian to every single school without one, that would be less than $4 million, though in total, perhaps $8 million, because we would have to have an equal amount for our charter schools. That said, I think it's an achievable amount, and it's an amount that we ought to find funds for, because I think it's vital for the educational success of our students. And I also want to thank you for the Budget Support Act language allowing use of student activities funds for certain theater and musical expenses, and also strong support of the subtitle regarding scholarship and tuition assistance payments. I also support the COW's new proposed subtitles to structure how OSSI will provide grants to assess learning loss. We weren't on clocks in other committees, but we are on yours, and I'm going to stop there because I see the time is expiring. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and your staff for all of your work.
Thank you, Councilmember Che. Councilmember Silverman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the COW committee staff for the work that has gone into these recommendations. Let me start with the committee's recommendations on universal paid leave. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for acknowledging in the report the recommendations made by the Committee on Labor and Workforce Development. In particular, I'm very pleased to see that this Budget Support Act subtitle expands, as did the Labor Committee, paid medical leave benefits from 2 to 6 weeks. Which we found money for, the Labor Committee found money for in fiscal year 22. We as a council have more work to do, especially to expand paid leave benefits into 2023 and beyond. And I am looking forward to collaborating with you, Mr. Chairman, on this and other important improvements to the paid leave program. On a related topic, even though it's not a part of the recommendations before us today, I do want to keep working with you, Mr. Chairman, and our colleagues to address the needs of the Unemployment Trust Fund. Okay, I hope everyone can stay with me here for a moment, but the mayor's proposed budget addresses the low fund balance. We all know that the fund balance has gotten much lower because people were laid off and they needed, and that was the money to pay unemployment benefits. But the mayor proposes taking money from the Universal Paid Leave Fund. And I just want to emphasize to you, Mr. Chairman, to our colleagues, I do not think this is a strategic use of our dollars. And a more strategic use would be to obtain a low-cost federal loan for the trust fund. And here's why. I don't think we should just park money in a fund to build up the fund balance. We have residents who are struggling, and we should deploy these dollars now. That's what I've done in my committee. And I hope I can work with you, Mr. Chairman, and our colleagues to strategically use these dollars. Let me say a few more things. I'm glad to see the committee stabilize funding for the public charter schools. This came up, my at-large colleague mentioned this yesterday in our committee markup. I'm a big fan of the adult charters, and I believe this money stabilizes those charters. They provide critical workforce development for our city and will help our residents bounce back. I want to thank you for the out-of-school time grants. And let me just wrap up by saying, Mr. Chairman, that I think there's much more to do. I agree with my colleagues on librarians. We need more mental health supports. And I look forward to working with you on these and other issues. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Silverman. Councilmember Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to thank you and your staff for the hard work that was put into the budget recommendations before us today. I believe as we strive toward recovery, we must remember that our neighborhoods are only as strong as our most vulnerable residents. And I think we're making the right investments to ensure our most vulnerable residents have access to high quality educational opportunities, pre-K through higher ed. As we transition back to in-person learning, whether traditional K-12, early childhood, or various workforce development higher ed institutions, we must ensure some stability while also providing opportunities for students to catch up from after more than a year of virtual learning. One of these supports is the Office of Out of School Time, which I'm thrilled to see you provide $2 million to enhance those grants. This will certainly help working families to ensure that as families are going back to work, families don't have to stress, or parents rather, don't have to stress about finding childcare between that gap of time of when school lets out and when parents get home from work. I also appreciate the opportunity to work with you and your staff, Mr. Chairman, to expand the scope of the higher education tuition assistance payments at OSSI so that students can utilize those scholarships not just for admission to colleges around the district, but also to pay remaining balances that may prevent students from continuing their higher education, as well as to purchase necessary books and supplies, which we know is also an expense. It is important to note, combined with the additional assistance to UDC, which has made incredible strides, this will certainly have an impact. I want to say thank you for including policy recommendations I requested for OSSI to work with Octo to update its website, to organize its data in a user-friendly and interactive manner, which I think will help boost transparency on the DCPS budget. I know that earlier this year, the council voted on emergency legislation that I put forward to ensure that schools receive at least the same amount of funding as they did in school year 2021. While this proposed budget did not stop all the cuts, it's my hope that we can continue to work to ensure that our schools are made whole by the time we have the first vote on the budget later this month. During the course of those deliberations, I've heard from numerous early childhood and adult charter schools about the need for stabilization. I'm pleased that we've put a down payment on that of $5.6 million on this effort, and I hope that we can find more between now and final passage. Our adult learners and our youngest learners frankly deserve it. The additional FTEs for the ombudsman, the additional FTEs for the student advocate. Non-education related, I'd also like to acknowledge that the Office of Planning has funding for specialized redistricting software. As a member of that subcommittee, I'm looking forward to learning more about how OP can begin training the community on it very soon. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for the transfer of funding to the Committee on Health to fund my Maternal Health Resources and Access Act, which will provide transportation reimbursements to expecting mothers to get to and from critical appointments and provide coverage for doula services. So I will be supporting the recommendations before us today. Thank you. Sorry, I went over time.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Nadeau.
Thank you, Chairman. Just want to make sure I can see the clock.
Weren't you driving a minute ago?
Not me.
All right, maybe I missed the video, but okay, good.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman Mendelson, for all the work that you and your staff have done to produce this budget report in a challenging period. As a ward council member, the budget needs actions relating to the agencies that are a part of the district's education system are of special importance to me. While I'm enthused to see significant investments in the mayor's proposed FY22 budget, there remains gaps in funding that we must address. For example, the Birth to 3 program remains unfunded. The proposed FY22 budget provides 0 local recurring investments to expand childcare programs. Childcare workers continue to be one of the lowest paid occupations nationwide. When all occupations are ranked by annual pay, childcare workers remain nearly at the bottom percentile. Early childcare providers are disproportionately women of color who have mostly worked in person throughout the pandemic, and they deserve to be compensated appropriately for their work. Rather than commence a pilot program for fair pay, as the mayor proposes, fair pay should be implemented permanently in the FY22 budget. This proposed pilot program provides only a limited number of early educators a one-time payment of around $1,500 each. These educators need more than a one-time bonus. They deserve a fair wage. This simply does not cut it. If the district is truly committed to improving through an equitable lens, the committee must fully fund the Birth to 3 Act for all. My colleagues and I continue to voice our frustration over the deficiency to comprehensively fund libraries in all district schools. And I also want to voice my concern that we still do not have plans for a standalone Shaw Middle School. The feasibility study has identified 2 sites that can accommodate the required 550 students at about 200 students per grade level. Yet the mayor's budget fails to mention a long-term agenda to begin planning this endeavor. I look forward to working with my colleagues throughout the FY22 fiscal year to engage the executive as well as the community to make this reality in the coming year. I want to thank the committee and the chairman for its work to address the negative impacts of vacant and blighted buildings. I'm encouraged to see the committee's acknowledgement of a need for a greater investment in vacant and blighted building enforcement, and also by its policy recommendation to DCRA for a more robust quality assurance system, an increase in abatement of nuisance conditions, and a more aggressive defense of classifications of properties when appealed. My office has also been working extensively with ANCs, district agencies, and other community members to restart the pedestrian zone on 18th Street in Adams Morgan, which I enthusiastically support. And I was glad to see funding for the new Streets for People initiative in the Office of Planning that will support making a people-friendly 18th Street more permanent. And I hope that reduction in funds will not jeopardize that work. I'm glad to see some more much needed changes to the grant allocation and structures in the Committee on the Arts and Humanities. The proposed subtitle addresses issues that have been brought to me over the years, and I'm thrilled to see them. I'm generally opposed to reducing the size of allocations like this subtitle does, but I am hopeful that increasing the pie for all will help restore that funding. Once again, I want to thank you and your staff, and I look forward to seeing the priorities in this budget realized in the coming year. May I have a gold star, please?
Yes. Yes, they're for the asking today. I have next on the list, Councilmember Gray. Councilmember Gray, if you're speaking, you're muted.
Is that better, Mr. Chairman?
Well, I can hear you now.
Good. You may wish
Depends
you
on what
had.
you're saying, whether it's better.
Anyway, I want to echo some of the concerns that already have been raised by Councilmember Allen and Councilmember Nadeau around early childhood education. Mr. Chairman, there is no question that the District of Columbia is the leader in the nation for early childhood education. If you go back and look, the early childhood education, the universal early childhood education work that we did is actually a seminal piece of work for the entire nation. And now we have a chance to take that a step or two further. We began this process with the seminal Birth to 3 Act of, that was adopted by this council, and we now have a chance to be able to take that further, Mr. Chairman. So I want to offer an amendment today, which I've circulated to my colleagues previously. And essentially it goes as follows. The committee calls for OSSI to work collaboratively with child care advocates and the council to identify a way to enforce the pay parity requirements in the Birth to 3 Act by December 31st, 2021, which would give us time to be able to do the work that's necessary. The committee suggested OSSI use the $18.5 million in ARPA funding which has been identified for the pay parity pilot in fiscal year 23 to increase child care workers' pay by 20% and to work with the mayor to identify funds in fiscal years 2024 and beyond to continue increasing the early childhood education educators' salaries and according to the pay scale set forth in the Birth to Three Act. Just briefly in terms of the rationale, Mr. Chairman, these amendments would strike committee report language that I think is uncharacteristically critical of public witnesses testifying before the council. Additionally, these amendments strike report language and committee recommendations that take a firm position on the amount and timeline that the committee recommendation that additional child care funding and wage increases are needed. This issue will certainly be discussed at the full council, Mr. Chairman, and the results of that discussion hopefully will be captured in the Committee of the Whole's budget report for the fiscal year 2022 Local Budget Act of 2021. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's the legislation that I'm proposing, the amendment I'm proposing, and I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this.
Mr. Gray, I have not seen this amendment, and I'm just realizing that it was circulated at 4:01 today. And so I'm guessing that most of the members have not seen this. You began by reading some language that urged that OSSI do some funding, and I didn't think that sounded objectionable. But I'm just now seeing, and I don't have the ability to read two 84-line single-spaced of text. I just don't. So I would ask that you withdraw the amendment. There is some language on pages 57 and 58, or excuse me, on 57 of the report that I'm going to take out. The motion was to approve the report with leave for staff to make technical conforming and editorial changes. I'm going to strike the language that says the committee disagrees with this approach. I'm going to strike the language that says rather than take this haphazard approach, especially with a program that will ultimately cost hundreds of millions of dollars. I'll take those words out so that the language is more neutral in the report. And I'm willing to work with you with regard to some language that I heard you read at the beginning that suggested that I read it or heard it as being a policy recommendation that OSSI do more faster with some money for early childhood. And I'm willing to include that, to work with you on that so that the report will reflect those edits. But I don't have the ability, and I would be annoyed if other members saw this before it was circulated, because as I said, I didn't see it until, well, I didn't see it until just now, but it was circulated at 4:01. So I don't have the ability to even understand the 85 lines of text. So
Yeah,
would that
I'm
be?
sorry about that, Mr. Chairman. It is an issue that was alluded to by Councilmember Allen and Councilmember Nadeau. And I'll be happy to work with you, Mr. Chairman. But I believe the progress that we've made is unmatched in the nation. You look at what the president has done around universal pre-kindergarten, and he is proposing that we have, a policy and funding for universal pre-kindergarten now. So, Mr. Chairman, I would look forward to working with you to get this done, but I don't think we can make these workers wait any longer, Mr. Chairman. Time is of the essence, and we have set the tone for this in the nation, and we need to continue to deliver on the promises that we've made to our children and to our families and to our dedicated workers who work very hard with this, Mr. Chairman.
So are you okay if you, instead of moving this report language, that I strike those sentences that I mentioned and that I work with you in adding the language that you want added?
Yeah, I'm of course willing to work with you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay,
I want to make sure I'm clear about, what you're striking from the report, because some of the language that's in this report I found objectionable myself. I'm glad that you're willing to take it out and that we can work together to find an answer to this solution, this issue, in a way that really supports people who work so hard to create the kind of early childhood education program that we want for the entire city.
okay. So I will work with you on that before we file the report.
Okay,
Was there anything else, Mr. Gray?
not on this, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Councilmember Trahan White?
Yes, thank you, Chairman, for your leadership on this and your team. The FY22 budget priorities of the committee are necessary during these unprecedented challenges and setbacks that we experienced during this COVID-19 pandemic. For most residents, especially Eastern Anacostia River, who are Black and brown, who experience extreme poverty, this has been some economic inequalities even prior to the pandemic that was even further exacerbated during this time. I think it's our opportunity as a council to use this as our bully pulpit to address some of the social inequities in the budget. I've been here since 2017. Our budget has risen from a $14.5 billion budget to a $17.5 billion budget. And the city is growing, but the people in the city who are in lower incomes don't feel the growth that everyone else feels. And so I'll be asking some of the tough questions during this time as we approve this and go on to have further discussions about the budget to address the issue of equity, inclusion, social justice in our policies. And so I start off with a few, right? There's a $2 million increase in out of school time grants and a 16 point, Councilmember Gray, your phone is, your computer's unmuted. Grants and a $16,800 to fund UDC Master's Gardener Program expansion in Ward 7 and 8. Also, I like that the committee supports the mayor's proposed 3.6% increase in UPSFF increase for the amount equaling to $11,720 per student in DC's education. Also, an $8 million investment in federal funding that will expand school-based mental health initiative and increase school-based mental health services. This is desperately needed for students who have been disengaged and struggling during this academic year. We've seen the gap increase and learning loss in the city. The committee also encourages the DME, RC, and LEAs to develop a contingency plan to educate students who enrolled in a school but not attend in person, who also may have a medical need and refuse to do so. The committee recommends changes to the University of District of Columbia budget to form an increase of $29.7 million in federal funds to reflect the receipt of the 2 additional rounds of COVID-19 relief awards. I also am impressed by the $17.7 million provided by the Coronavirus Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2020 and the $12 million for the American Rescue Plan. I'll go down. I'm also in favor of the proposed amendment by Councilman Gray. I know he's pulling it, but I've heard from educators who talked about they're working from, one worker said she had to get up at 4:45 a.m. and don't get off to 7 p.m. and can't even afford to live in the district based on the wages she's receiving from working in early child care. So I support additional funds for early child care workers. I do want to note that the city, the proposed FY22 budget support 2 new citywide focuses on the Office of Planning initiative to address the food access program known as Nourish DC, which utilizes federal grants dollars and the Streets for People initiative in an effort to reimagine public spaces and reclaim streets for people through the creation of recurring monthly street closures along various corridors. There are many things in this budget I like. I think that we can do more and will do more to ensure we can provide equity in this budget for some of the most neediest residents. Not looking for a handout, but a hand up. I want to thank you, Chairman, and those and your staff and then the budget officer who worked on this budget. I look forward to continuous dialogue as we move to the finish line of this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember White. Councilmember Pinto.
Thank you very much, Chairman Mendelson, for you and your entire staff's hard work to develop these committee recommendations. I want to reiterate what you said earlier for all those listening, that this is still the little cow, and there's much more work to be done in the next couple of weeks. But I am really pleased to see significant investments in the Office of the Ombudsman and Office of the Student Advocate under the State Board of Education, as well as investments in the Zero Waste program within OSSI. I'm appreciative of your efforts to provide clear parameters for the implementation of high dosage tutoring contracts so that we can have continued transparency. Thank you very much, Councilmember Nadeau, for mentioning the importance of a standalone Shaw Middle School, which I wholeheartedly support. I'll also echo some of my colleagues' sentiments on the need to have librarians in every school, and want to thank our Ward 2 State Board of Education Representative Alistair Chang for all of his work and leadership in this important area. I am happy to see updates to the Commission on Arts and Humanities funding formula, which is desperately needed to ensure that we are best supporting the artists in our community. However, I'm very concerned that the language still includes a decrease in funding for humanities DC from 5% of CAH's budget to 4%. While the recent report proposes funding at a higher level than 2019 levels, I don't think that should be our measure of success as we continue to get reopened and recover from the pandemic. We need to be investing in the arts as a strategy, not only for economic recovery, but for the benefit of residents' mental health and resiliency. So I really hope that we can all continue to work together to increase the humanities DC budget. I'm also concerned about a decrease to the Streets for People initiative. Councilmember Tran White mentioned. I was excited to hear about the Office of Planning's mission to reclaim street space for pedestrians. This is a program that is very needed for businesses and residents. Many stores and restaurants were not able to have their own streeteries due to space constraints, and the Streets for People initiative will allow many of these businesses to benefit from outdoor street space, and it will help enliven our neighborhoods, attract tourists, and encourage residents to use more green transportation options. So again, as you noted, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to continue to work together in the coming weeks on additional investments in the full cow, including additional direct support for rent relief for our small businesses, support for our hotels, more funding for excluded workers, permanent supportive housing vouchers, funding for Ford's Theater, the Children's Museum, Volta Park, the C&O Canal, Duke Ellington pay disparity that needs to be addressed still, EV charging station, and many other priorities, which I know we share. So thank you very much for all of the work, and look forward to continue to work together.
Thank you, Councilmember Pinto. I don't see anybody else who wishes to speak. Oh, that wasn't an invitation. Councilmember Bonds, and then Councilmember Robert White, second round. Councilmember Bonds.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And of course, thanks to your team of the Committee of the Whole for this document. It is very comprehensive, as of course we knew it would be. I wanted to express appreciation for a number of things that are important to me, other than those things that my colleagues have already mentioned. One, I have a great appreciation for the proposed addition of 3 new attorneys at the Office of Zoning that will replace the current arrangement of those that sort of pitch hit from the Office of the Attorney General. I think that this will improve the process and make the process faster, and it will get better products from the Office of Zoning. And I'm looking forward to DGS finding larger space to accommodate this newly, hopefully reconfigured office. I also appreciate the support that you're giving that goes to our out of school time grants and outcomes program. Thanks so very much for that. I think it will help tremendously, particularly in neighborhoods where, again, as my colleagues have pointed out, where parents have to depend on these after-school programs for the enrichment of their young people, but also because it's the right thing to do. And we're hopefully helping them to continue the learning models as they leave their school environment. I am very appreciative of the high dosage tutoring that will occur across all schools. As it aims to improve the educational outcomes. And as it relates to education, I'm very appreciative of the Deputy Mayor for Education's letter that he sent to the public charter school, asking that they consider the underutilization of existing schools. In fact, they're at less than 65% filled as they think about doing things such as ensuring new school options are of the highest quality and meet identified community needs. In other words, I think it's important that we fill those schools before we consider bringing new schools online. And I also want to speak to the high demand career pathways at UDC. And I'm really looking forward to the creation of these new career opportunities. And I applaud you for pulling that out of the plans and that you have endorsed the 3 chosen career fields. And with that, I think, thank you very much. And thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. Before I go to Councilmember Robert White on second round, I see Councilmember Louis George has joined us. And she wanted to be recognized.
Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm sorry I wasn't here individually. I wanted to say thank you and to your staff who has worked so hard on this budget here. I had a whole thing written, but I want to just point to one fact that, Chairman, you've been working on diligently, and we've doing oversight as well as during several hearings, but I'm on the scene on 9th and Kennedy, where there was a collapse of a building. And we are still in the process of trying to get an individual, DC Fire EMS are trying to get an individual out. My point to this is DCRA and the funding that we need to critically to make sure that DCRA is funded is a matter of people's lives. When DCRA is not operating properly, when DCRA doesn't have enough staff to do what they need to do, does not have the capacity, this is what happens. This is not the first time we've had this happen on Kennedy Street, right? We had a fire occur where DCRA was involved, and then there were some balls that were dropped. We acknowledged that, and we've gone through that process. And now we're here again, where a building has collapsed. Residents in this community and the ANC commissioners have all reached out to DCRA about the adjoining property and some of the construction that has been happening and the legality of that construction. And they have not seen responsiveness from DCRA. And so as a result, here we are today, and this failure is now a life-saving issue right now. So there are literally life and death consequences to our budget decisions. And and we need to make sure we do this. You know, we hear from constituents every day about problems with DCRA and their enforcement of building codes and against vacant and blighted properties. We need a structural change, and this needs to get done, period. I want to say we need to pay our childcare workers now. I had a whole speech blown out. We don't need to. The point is, childcare workers have helped sustain this during this pandemic. They have been there for everybody, including individuals, colleagues on the council. Childcare workers have stood up and held everyone down. They don't need a pilot to figure out that they need to be paid more. We don't need a pilot a fair wage for critical workers, most of whom are Black and brown women. We need to pay them. We need to pay them now. This is like incrementalism isn't going to work here. Pay people wages, especially people who are the lifelines for many of us in this city and for all of us. We need to get our homeless residents housed, period. End of discussion. And a +1 to Councilmember Silverman's point on paid leave. We need to put people and workers first, period. And so, you know, I'm happy to see some of the changes. I'm happy to see the acceleration of some of our War for schools and what we have with some of the modernization. I would like it to be accelerated. But I'm also, tired of seeing our war for schools and seeing modernization delays and critical staffing positions cut. We have to do better by our next generation when it comes to our students, when it comes to our schools, period. And so we have a lot of work to do. The decisions we make, the way we do, the way we do our budgets literally have, the ability to life and death consequences. And so as we wait to see if this individual is going to be able to make it out of this and DC Fire EMS is working, we need to be working in overtime to make sure that we are getting the funding that's needed to do what we need to do with DCRA. That's it. And that's what I want to say. So I want to thank you, Chairman. I want to thank your committee and all your committee staff. I know how, this is a long process, and but I want to make sure that we do what needs to be done, and we really recognize the reality of how much our work and our budget impacts real people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. So there was a building collapse. Is there somebody who's still trapped?
Yes, we have an individual, a worker. There were workers working at the time. There were about 5 workers there. 4 of them are out. They don't have they don't have life-threatening injuries. Right now, they're doing fine. We have an individual. He is talking to DC Fire EMS. They are steadily working to get him pulled out of there. And so we are just trying to make sure they're telling me they're the last bit of being able to get him out of here, to get him out of from underneath there.
Okay, so you're optimistic he'll be rescued?
Absolutely.
Good. Let me see. I've put off Councilmember Robert White twice. There is a Kenya McDuffie on first round. Mr. White, do you want to go now or can you wait?
I can wait, Chair.
Okay, Councilmember McDuffie, first round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, Councilmember White. As I've said throughout this budget process, it really is paramount that we use the budget to challenge the status quo and really try to chip away at some of the stark racial inequities that exist throughout our city. And so I want to thank you and your staff for some of the work that you've done with this this budget in this little cow. And so as chair of the Committee on Business and Economic Development, I continue to work closely with our city's small and local businesses and have seen firsthand the havoc that COVID-19 and this pandemic has really wreaked on the district's local economy. And so I'm grateful for the support of the various committees, in fact, that have provided support to businesses throughout the District of Columbia and their respective budgets, in particular transfers from the Committee on Labor that I know you're coordinating with, Mr. Chairman. I'm also pleased to see this committee has protected the funds necessary on a host of priorities that I have that reflect the priorities of residents throughout Ward 5 and small businesses throughout the district. In addition to some of the things that we've done around small local businesses, I think it's no secret how important public safety is to residents across the District of Columbia, particularly the safety of our youth. And so I'm excited about the expansion of the Safe Passage program through the partnership between the Deputy Mayor for Education and the Department of For-Hire Vehicles, which I think is going to provide on-demand rides for students in Ward 7 and 8. In my committee's budget recommendations, I've asked the Department of For-Hire Vehicles to consider expanding this service to other underserved areas of the district. And I know that Councilmember Janice Lewis-George questioned the director about programs in her ward and Ward 4, and I imagine some of my other ward council members may feel similarly. Additionally, I applaud the committee's efforts to increase funding to support the ability of the out of school time program, to increase the number of youth directly impacted by programming by the Office of Out of School Time Grants and Youth Outcomes. I also know how important workforce development is to enhancing both public safety and economic stability of the district's residents and businesses. And for this reason, I share in the committee's support to identify funding for the creation and sustainability of workforce training pathways at UDC, specifically in the area of STEM and IT. And so I look forward to working with you and your staff, Mr. Chairman, to support these efforts a little later. Finally, I want to say that even though talking about the environment. I'll make this brief, Mr. Chairman, if you indulge me for another 45 seconds. I believe access to clean air and healthy environment is a crucial element to achieving greater racial equity. And while I understand the need for a new bus terminal facility, I am concerned with the committee's continued support for the facility to be located on W Street in Ward 5, and with the continued practice by the district of placing industrial facilities in close proximity to residential neighborhoods. Even though the benefit of such facilities accrues to residents across the entire city, the fact remains that Ward 5 carries the bulk of the burden of industrial facilities in their neighborhoods, which includes significant impacts to the air quality environment in neighborhoods where people live and children play. And these are primarily people and children of color. And so I appreciate the committee's efforts to respond to residents' concerns and vehement opposition to this project. And while I understand that the land is zoned for commercial use, the residents of Brentwood do not want this in their neighborhood, and I stand with them in their opposition. So again, thank you. I appreciate all your work on this budget, and I will be supporting it here today and look forward to all the other things that we need to do that the council members have already articulated earlier. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Robert White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by saying what I think we all think, which is that I hope that the gentleman trapped in that building on 9th and Kennedy is safe. I drove past that construction site this morning and really thought, wow, there are a lot of construction projects on Kennedy Street. And so it's difficult to think that one of these structures I was just seeing people work at this morning has collapsed and threatened someone's life. So it does put into perspective the work that we do and the importance of well-functioning government. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for some significant investments and policy proposals that you made in this budget, particularly in education, that will help stabilize our schools and provide much needed guidance to our education agencies as they plan to transition back to in-person learning opportunities. But I note the concern that several of my colleagues have raised that schools are still telling us that they are losing staff members, despite assurances that we got from the DC public schools that they would not, and also share concern and hope that we will move forward birth to 3 the way that we need to and committed 2 years ago. You've made investments in proposed changes that will protect mothers and babies, with an emphasis on Black and Latino women who have alarmingly high maternal mortality rates, create greater equity in our arts and humanities funding, and provide much needed support for UDC, our only public institution of higher learning, and expand support for early childhood education by providing our high school students more opportunities for early childhood education, training, and careers. I want to highlight just a few things. The funding for Maternal Health Resources and Access Act, almost $1.5 million. This is so important to expand access to doula services by establishing a pilot program for Medicaid reimbursement for doula services and feasibility study on establishing birthing centers east of the Anacostia River. I want to note the $2 million in federal funds to increase out of school time funds. That is so important. And we've heard from numerous parents and educators on the importance of that funding. $1.5 million reduction in the DME's budget for MPD de-escalation training. Certainly this funding would have been redundant, and so I support that funding cut. I want to highlight the funding of a new FTE for the Office of the Ombudsman to support increase in caseloads during and after the pandemic, and funding for an additional FTE for the Office of the Student Advocate. Both offices have been a lifeline to families and certainly have not grown as their responsibilities have grown. I do want to note one concern, which is the cut to the grant funding for Humanities DC, which I've mentioned to you. During last year's budget, I voiced my concerns about the lack of equity in the Commission on the Arts and Humanities grant funding structure, because larger arts groups, the National Capital Arts Cohort, was receiving a set-aside from the city and did not have to compete for grants funds like smaller organizations outside of the cohort. I challenged NCAC to develop a plan that would create greater equity in funding and would support smaller arts organizations and individual musicians like go-go and jazz artists that were not receiving anywhere near the amount of grant funding and financial support that members of that cohort were receiving. To NCAC's credit, they accepted the challenge and eventually determined that it was best to dissolve the cohort, which I fully agree with and support. But I do struggle with this proposal because it reduces funding for humanities DC after a long fight to increase that funding. So that is something that I hope we can look toward addressing as we move the budget forward. I do look forward to supporting this budget. Certainly there's always more that we can do, but I want to recognize the many good things done in this budget proposal, and thank you and your staff who have worked really tirelessly over the past several days and several weeks to get us here as the committee of the whole. So thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. I think everybody who wanted to be recognized has been recognized. Councilmember Gray, second round. Councilmember Gray, if you're speaking, you're muted.
How about now, Mr. Chairman?
Can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. I just want to be clear about what it is that you and I have agreed upon and we're going to work on in terms of language, because some of this, of course, is very important to people who worked on Bertha 3, the advocates who are there, and some of that's been, underscored in some of the comments that were made in the aftermath. So I just want to ask you, Mr. Chairman, if you would, clarify for people what it is that you have agreed that we will work on in the aftermath. I mean, I've got my language that I brought into the meeting with me. You said you had not seen it, you hadn't seen it, and I'm hopeful that we can go over that again, when you and I meet. But I do want to meet with you as soon as we possibly can, so that there's no confusion or lack of clarity about where we are going with what we agreed to.
What I had said was that there was, when I moved the report, I moved it with leave for staff to make technical conforming and editorial changes. And consistent with that, what I had said was that I will strike at least a couple of phrases, one of which says the committee disagrees with this approach, and another of which says rather than take this haphazard approach, especially with a program that will ultimately cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And then I said that I wanted to work with you to see if I could incorporate some of the language that you proposed adding. I have not had the ability to digest. In fact, my staff just gave me 2 versions of what you circulated. So I haven't had the ability to digest any of it, but I want to work with you to see if I can incorporate some of the language you're proposing. This is not the end of the discussion with regard to early childhood educators, and I will be working with you and others between now and July 20th. So I don't look at this report as being dispositive on the issue, but it doesn't have to have the language, and I cited 2 phrases that are that are offending.
Okay, well, excuse me, I'll look forward to continuing to work with you, Mr. Chairman. The language is, of course, important in anything we do legislatively here, but on this particular legislation, there are issues that we need to make sure we're absolutely clear on. We've all been approached. I mean, I did the legislation originally. We've all been approached in one way or the other by others who expressed it today, Mr. Chairman, on what needs to be done about the wages, the pay for people who are involved in early childhood education. So what I'd like to do, Mr. Chairman, is I'll give you my language as I was proposing it today, and would like to be able to work with you to make sure that we are in agreement with what we've agreed to move forward on.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
If there's no further discussion, we have the committee report as circulated yesterday at 4:09 p.m. and with leave for staff. I think we can do this by voice vote. I haven't looked at any of the other markups. I don't know if they're doing by roll call or voice vote, but I'll do this by voice vote. On the the motion, the report with leave for staff. All those in favor say aye.
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 Are there no votes? I don't see or hear any no votes. So the motion passes unanimously. Before I adjourn the meeting, I do want to thank staff. Evan Cash, who's the Committee and Legislative Director. Christina Sutlow, who's the Deputy Committee Director. Lakeisha Jordan, who's the Legislative Policy Analyst.
Second, let me do this.
Works on education and including DCPS. Blaine Stum, who's the Legislative Policy Analyst, works on DCRA as well as other issues. Max Brossi, who's with us this summer, is a McCourt Fellow. And in addition, I want to thank Ann Phelps, Jonathan Antista from the Budget Office, Dan Golden and Lauren Mendonca from the General Counsel's Office. And of course, that's not a list of everybody, but I did want to thank them. So that's going to conclude this meeting of the Committee of the Whole. The time is 5:13 in the afternoon, and this meeting is adjourned.